In a critical election season, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s presidential bid is closely tied to his choice of vice president.
Nicole Shanahan. Nicole Shanahan.
Who is Nicole Shanahan?
Oh, I can't believe he picked her.
Her scarce public appearances and the campaign's silence on key voter concerns have stirred unease among his core voter base.
Could potentially hurt this campaign.
Ties to Mr. Soros.
As you see there, she's donated a lot of money.
This is fundamentally a play on Silicon Valley money.
She was married to the Google founder, for goodness sake.
Nicole Shanahan's connections have not only raised eyebrows, but her associations and actions seem to align with the very structures Kennedy has publicly opposed. From her ties to influential tech moguls to her support for figures aligned with George Soros, her stance appears to contradict everything Kennedy stands for. If Kennedy cannot reconnect with his base, his ambitious plans for reform could come to a screeching halt. Can Robert reconcile these contradictions before it's too late? Early on, in my opinion, and my wife and I have had a lot of conversations around this. She doesn't particularly pay attention to it, but I got to talk to somebody about it. And she believes in freedom. She believes in the change that's taking place. She believes in this emergence of a new consciousness and new system. She just doesn't pay attention to all the details necessarily. And frankly, she has a good point. She says a lot of times it starts turning into sort of like political porn, where you become addicted to, just listening to the shock and awe of what can feel like the chaos of the evolving world. So, Kennedy, by really just I think the nature of following principles, following values, following intuition, and following a playbook, had put himself in a position where I think he could become the next president of the United States. And I'm not saying that anything I'm going to share around his vice presidential pick, Nicole Shanahan, it changes that. But what I would say is it was a surprising pick. And so I want to share my thoughts around this. And also, in fairness to the political conversation, I think that this election, it's probably cliche to say, they probably say this with every election, is the most important election of our lifetime. But it's the most important election because of the disclosure that's taking place and the awareness that democracy has been seized or captured for quite a while now, and the at least the obviousness. I mean, perhaps it's a new level of intensity, but the obviousness of the propaganda that we're being served up as American citizens and global citizens, the two-party political system, the two-party propaganda or media system, so many things that we've learned through the process of going through the pandemic and COVID-19 around how quote unquote science works, and how you can have two completely opposing viewpoints that can be considered science, and how much our science is actually influenced by capitalism and corporationism, and the corporate capture and influence of non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations, from the CDC to the World Health Organization to the American Pediatric Association. So, we're learning a lot about how things either have worked that we weren't aware of for a while, that aren't congruent and aligned with, I think, any of our values. Now, some people just aren't able to experience this. The transparency of what's happening because of their own personal biases and because of media manipulation. So there's still a lot of people who are sort of, playing that it's their fault game with politics or with healthcare or with finance or with the military, with the war, right? But there's a much greater nuance when you actually start to understand the details. You see that there is a force at work here that has a level of cohesion that spans across military influence, political influence, media influence, financial interests, and governance. And so it is an important election. I don't think everything is going to flush out in this election. I believe that the individuals who are showing up for this election are just reflections of our own consciousness. I have doubts about whether or not humanity internally has developed themselves, that we have developed ourselves enough to actually put into place new systems that will represent the greatest and best of what we're capable of. I think in order to do that, we have to do a lot more work on ourselves. And this really goes back to my episode, 2 episodes ago, where I talked about the reaction that I experienced after having published my first episode on my conversation, my private dinner with Bobby Kennedy Jr., I talked about how it's very difficult to have political conversations with people, and that until we can get to a place that we're able to have conversations and have disagreements without those activating triggers within us or unprocessed trauma, we're still going to see that trauma expressing itself externally. So, I'm not so sure we're ready for a Bobby Kennedy to take office right now. If the measurement of the results externally is correlated to the measurement of who we've become internally, I'm not so sure that we've developed ourselves to a level of deserving a Bobby Kennedy as our president. But, the results will show them, will indicate that, right, one way or another. But he's played it basically perfectly, and then he selected Nicole Shanahan as his vice presidential pick. So I got to experience firsthand a lot of what you all felt about that pick, because you commented on my previous 2 episodes, the episode where I shared my private dinner with Bobby Kennedy and the episode where I talked a little bit about the backlash of my first episode. There were a number of you who said, hey, I was all for RFK, but, now I'm not so sure. I don't understand this pick. He did it just for the money. Hey, she's a George Soros lackey. And I'm going to get into addressing as best as I can, not being an expert on pretty much anything, but being thoughtful about my observations in the world and trying to operate from really a root cause first principles standpoint. I want to share some feedback around these pieces. I will say that my understanding is Nicole Shanahan was not his first pick. And again, this is just speculation, but there was a short list of people, and I was told by a very credible source that short list was accurate. All the people on most of the short lists were on the short list. And, I looked at that list at one point after I had already picked my VP. I wanted to play sort of presidential draft pick. And I had one pick, and I'll tell you who my pick was in a second, that I think would have put him over the edge and would have, I won't say guaranteed that he became the next president of the United States, but I would have bet strong if this was his running mate. But on the short list were people like Jesse Ventura, and I'm not quite sure how you could possibly entertain Jesse Ventura, as seemingly great of a governor as he is. And I don't know the guy personally, but I appreciate, a lot of his perspectives, a lot of what he was describing as conspiracy theories, 15 years ago have turned out to be absolute fact. I like what Russell Brand says, the difference between a conspiracy theory and fact these days is about 6 months. But Jesse Ventura doesn't get you anywhere. In fact, Jesse Ventura puts you in a worse position for the people whose votes you're trying to win over, which, as RFK says himself, right, are the baby boomers, the people who are still influenced to legacy media, or trying to get some of the non-voters who might become, active in voting, new voters. But Jesse Ventura doesn't get you any of that. In fact, Jesse Ventura just reinforces the image that the legacy media has, effectively at some level portrayed of Bobby Kennedy Jr. as a wacko conspiracy theorist. And it's no disrespect to Jesse Ventura, but that's just what it looks like. And Kennedy doesn't need any more weights on that scale. And then you've got people like Aaron Rodgers. And, I listened to the last Aaron Rodgers interview with Joe Rogan. I don't have a perspective like Aaron Rodgers is a dumb jock. He seems as intelligent as the next guy. Obviously he had some inclination, intuition around, vaccines and I think a lot of what Aaron Rodgers has talked about has proven out to be true around at least the COVID vaccine. And I like the fact that he, had a strong opinion for himself. But I think there's just a stigma having a professional athlete. It almost is worse to have a professional athlete at the level of athleticism and success that Aaron Rodgers is. Sort of delegitimizes again the campaign. It would be like having LeBron James as your running mate, or Serena Williams as your running mate, or Wayne Gretzky as your running mate. I'm not saying there are Wayne Gretzky. I just went back a few years, but it's just what I pulled out. I'm not saying that there aren't some professional athletes who couldn't be fantastic politicians. There have been. One guy comes to mind right now. I think he played at Princeton. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, Aaron Rodgers wouldn't have gotten Kennedy over the finish line. Tulsi Gabbard doesn't get you anywhere. she came out and basically said something along the lines of she was offered the position and she turned it down, or they were discussing it and she was the one who, said no to the second date. At least that was my understanding in the way that the independent news or alternative media reported it. But Tulsi Gabbard doesn't get you anywhere. Tulsi Gabbard might get you a few more Republican voters who were already on the fence anyway and just didn't want to vote for Trump. But it doesn't get you anywhere. The guy who was my pick, that I think if you were going to design a vice presidential candidate that was perfect for Bobby Kennedy Jr., you had to have somebody who was taken seriously by the business community. You had to have somebody who people adored. You had to have somebody who was not perceived as politically oriented, blue or red, left or right. You had to have somebody who was a powerful leader. You had to have somebody who had a significant following and could bring, 5 to 10 million new voters over to Bobby, because that's what he needs in order to win this election. Somebody who, if the media attacked, would make it even more obvious that the media was biased and captured. And that's Tony Robbins. I think Tony Robbins, I get the chills when I even think about it. I was like, and I told my wife this long before there was any short list. I said, Kennedy's been playing it so right. You know what the mic drop would be? If he named Tony Robbins as his vice presidential pick. That would be the whole two-party system just went boom. And it adds so much legitimacy, right? Having somebody not only say, I endorse Kennedy, but I'm going to run on his ticket of the caliber of Tony Robbins, like that is an absolute game changer. And my understanding was that for a period of time, Tony was a yes. And Tony could not end up doing it because, I don't know, I guess it was about 8 years ago, Tony sold his company to private equity, and he's got a contract to deliver on a certain number of events in order to generate a certain amount of revenue. In the model that he pursued with private equity, which I believe was an employee stock option program where he sold, a chunk of his company to his employees and a chunk of his company to private equity, and he took down a chunk of money. And as a result of that, he couldn't do it. He would have defaulted on his agreement. And so Tony was out, and that's where I talk about. I was speaking to somebody who was a part of the campaign who expressed a lot of disappointment around that, and I said, "Man, that's not a thing we can control. All of these are chess pieces that move based on the consciousness of where we're at right now. All the result of this election and how slowly or quickly the old system disintegrates and the new system emerges is directly correlated to how slowly or quickly we process the unprocessed trauma of the last thousands of years that are held in the neural networks of our brains, in our nervous systems, that are representing themselves through sideways expressed emotions like anger and jealousy and comparing and indecision and feeling less than and anxiety and depression. Some of those things are due to environmental toxins, but all of these things that that show unintelligent thinking that still resides inside of us. The external world is just an indication of that. So, the fact that Tony Robbins coincidentally couldn't run as Kennedy's vice presidential pick, it's not a coincidence. It's either time or it's not. So Bobby went with Nicole Shanahan, and pretty much all of us went, who? What? Like, it came out about a week before, and I remember just thinking, oh man, just tell me this isn't it. Like, go pick Rand Paul. Go pick somebody who, it's tough. I think about who else you could have picked that could have bridged the voter gap that you needed. And I've been open-minded. Like, okay, Nicole Shanahan. Kennedy came out and said, I remember actually at that dinner that I was at with him, that I hosted with 40 people in a private mansion in Austin, Texas. If you want to hear the takeaways from that interview, look back about 5 or 6 episodes. In my conversation with him for 2.5 hours, he didn't reveal at that time who the vice presidential candidate was, but he said, America's just going to fall in love with her. So when they announced her, I was like, okay, let's date. Let me fall in love with you. And so I started looking to see what I could hear. YouTube is my platform, about Nicole Shanahan. And the only thing I could find was a Rick Rubin interview that went live about 2 days after the announcement. And it was clearly recorded prior to the announcement, and Rick Rubin is, asking her questions about her involvement with the Kennedy campaign. It's clear that they may know that she's going to be announced, or they held off on it. The interview is about 2 hours long. I think I consumed about 45 minutes of it, and she shares her story as what I experience as a mother, a fierce mother, a mother who cares about her daughter. Her daughter had autism. The story that she tells is absolutely heartbreaking, that I think it was around 12, 16, 18 months into the life of her daughter that basically she described it, the light in my daughter went out. And, I have a 20-month-old son now at the time of this recording, and I cannot imagine what that would be like to have a goo-goo goggling, active baby who's growing and learning and seeing the world, and all of a sudden stops speaking, stops engaging, and as Shanahan describes, the light in her little daughter went out. It's devastating. And it is one of the reasons why, regardless of who we have in office, regardless of whether you think autism or ADHD or any of these developmental disorders are due to vaccinations or not, we have to figure this out. Like, we have to figure out why 1 in 24 boys have autism. We have to figure out why overall 1 in 36 children have autism. And that's setting aside all the other developmental disorders, all of the childhood allergies that have, just exploded since the late 80s. And we have to figure this out. But so she's telling the story, and she's talking about restoring science. And I really like that. I like how she talks about, and how she's comfortable with talking about how the scientific model has been manipulated, and how we have to get back to real science, and how she's been actively involved in working with and funding and collaborating with very, very, very smart people in Silicon Valley. Say what you want about the progressive left or Silicon Valley or internet platforms, smart people who are now really trying to figure out what is this, because what she described as they're treating this as a behavioral disorder, but it's not. It's a medical condition. And so she went into a lot of detail around that. If you're interested in it, or if you have someone that you care about or you love, or someone in your family who has autism or another childhood developmental disorder, I do recommend listening to that interview with Rick Rubin, because she talks about a lot of the medical doctors and the alternative medical doctors who are doing great work in this area. And up until 12 days ago, that was the only interview with Nicole Shanahan. And so that was shocking to me. Since then, there's been an interview that's been published on, and I'm looking down at my notes if you're watching on YouTube right now, because it's a lot of information. I don't have all this memorized. But she also appeared 12 days ago at the time of this recording, which was around April 12th, on The Illusion of Consensus with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. That's probably how you say his last name. At least it's close. And I've seen this guy before. He's a professor of medicine from Stanford. I had a lot of opinions on vaccines. But this is a channel with 335 subscribers and 3 videos. So I don't know, maybe the guy's got the world's biggest podcast, and you can comment below and let me know that I'm just not, as aware as I should be if I'm going to record and talk about something. But I don't know how you go almost a month, over a month now, and there's no interviews with the vice presidential candidate that nobody knows anything about other than the Illusion of Consensus podcast or YouTube show with 335 subscribers and 3 videos. So, what a lot of people have a lot of questions. And I think strategically, if you're going to name Nicole Shanahan your vice presidential candidate, you got to have a plan for the post announcement. And, maybe there was a plan, maybe there is a plan, maybe there's some great plan here. And I'm going to look back on this episode and be embarrassed that I even recorded it. One of the things that I've realized in having some proximity to the Kennedy campaign, and also some of the stuff that came out around the Trump campaign, like they were talking about when Trump won, he was like in a room with 5 other people, and he didn't expect to win at that time. And like there isn't a machine of people sitting around you. It's not like a Fortune 5,000 company trying to get you elected as president. I mean, there is a machine at some level. You look at the Clinton campaign and some of the behind the scenes that we've been able to see about how they ran their campaign. People call it a machine, but even then, honestly, it's amateur hour. Like, I haven't announced this on the podcast, but my intention is to run for president in 2032. It has been my intention since 2015. I'll do a different episode and share that story. But by the time I run for president, it will be a machine. It will be the same way I treat a venture-backed business venture. I mean, you're talking about, putting tens to hundreds to billion plus dollars to work. Like you're basically a 24-month, venture startup, and you have to treat it that way. And but that's not how these campaigns are treated. Believe it or not, it's kind of amateur hour in terms of getting somebody into office. And most of the people who are running for political office, they're not entrepreneurs. They've never built businesses. They're not CEOs. They've never built big systems or processes. And again, I don't know. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, right? Like part of this is me giving you my opinion. I also recognize that, there's a lot of information out there that I don't have access to. And this is one of those times where I'm sharing outside of my area of authoritative expertise around mindset, personal growth, metaphysics, first principles, behavioral psychology, neurobiology. That's my jam, combined with business. So I could be totally wrong here, but Kennedy was an attorney, and we work with attorneys. Attorneys are not entrepreneurs. Attorneys are not building machines that go out and execute and produce returns on investment and very specific outcomes, like the machine of Google or the machine of Tesla or the machine of Facebook or the machine of Amazon. And so like these political expeditions, they're fairly amateur. And so I wouldn't be surprised, even though I'm surprised, if there was no post-announcement plan that anticipated the questions that people would have and the feedback that people would have and that would deal with those objections immediately. See, that's what we do in marketing, right? In marketing, we know the proposition that we're going to make, which is the product, right? Or the promise or the announcement. And then we anticipate what the objections are that people are going to have. And then because we're anticipating it, we design objection handlers that actually use the objections to our advantage to further the sale. And I believe that's what should have happened here with the Nicole Shanahan announcement. And so let's take a look at some of the objections. And let's talk about objection handlers. And let's hope, if you're actually wanting to see Kennedy in office as the president and Shanahan as the vice president, that these folks start to deal with some of these objections in a more appropriate way or powerful way. Number one, she seems to appear as part of the progressive left, right? Let me get a sip of my tea here. I'm getting all fired up. My chamomile tea. If you look at some of her resume on paper, she seems like she's part of the progressive left, right? So she's married to this guy. What's his name? I think it's Jeremy Krantz. I can't even read my own chicken scratch, right? He was an investor out in San Francisco. She marries him. They get divorced. Then she marries Sergey Brin, right, who is one of the founders of Google. And you think of those guys as sort of the front row of the World Economic Forum, right? I'm not saying they're all evil, but I'm just saying that, the Zuckerbergs, the Brins, the Larry Pages, the Eric Schmidts, all these guys. Not even having looked at, okay, so what is the political activism or what is the where does Sergey Brin put his money? What initiatives does he support? It just feels like you're talking about the VIP section of the World Economic Forum. And it's like everything that Bobby stands against, right? It's like internet platforms, internet control, collusion with the government, collusion with the media, creating an agenda, moving the world in a direction that the rest of us are not interested in going in. And it's like, oh, this is his ex-wife. And they obviously had some things in common. Granted, there was a divorce, but that doesn't make the orthodox Bobby Kennedy supporter very comfortable. And it certainly is going to bring up a lot of questions or hesitance or resistance from the Bobby Kennedy swing voters. So you got to address it. You got to come out right out of the gates, get her on an interview where someone is, even if you set it up, someone is asking, put her on my show. I'll ask her the question. She can know that it's coming, and then you come with a reasonable response. And Kennedy gave a reasonable response. I'm going to share that response with you here in a second, but I want to kind of double click on this. Apparently, right, she was a supporter of many people. So she took many of the millions that she made, as an attorney, as someone who had a legal tech startup. She sold her legal tech startup to a competitor. Then she marries Sergey Brin. They get divorced. She gets some sort of alimony. She's supposedly got a lot of dough. So she starts financing a lot of different things. Cool things. Go back and listen to that Rick Rubin interview, like, for fertility studies in women, funding and understanding of why children are experiencing this chronic disease epidemic. The noble things to be funding, to be clear. She also funds George Gascon in LA. Okay. She funds the Clintons. Well, this starts to raise some eyebrows. George Gascon, apparently, and I'm not an expert, was... There are a group of district attorneys and mayors and local politicians who kind of jumped on this bandwagon of defund the police. And this defund the police thing, many people believe is responsible for effectively the destruction of some of the greatest cities in America. You look at Los Angeles right now, a lot of people are moving out. I went back to LA recently. The homeless problem is just explosive. There are the iconic Starbucks in the middle of West Hollywood gone because they got tired of people coming in there and smashing windows. Retail stores tired of people stealing, having local laws like in San Francisco or Portland where you can steal up to $1,000 or $2,000 of stuff without even getting pulled into the police station or being given a misdemeanor because the police are being defunded. And a lot of this people believe is being promoted by George Soros. George Soros, who's a multi-billionaire, runs the Open Society Foundation, was notorious for trying to short the British pound, had a kind of a famous interview where he showed no remorse for being a Jew who turned over Jews during the Holocaust and kind of laughed about it, who's referred to himself as being a god or a demigod. It doesn't seem like the nicest guy. I've said in other episodes, he really feels like a modern day Penguin in Gotham City. And some people believe that he's turning some of the greatest cities in America into Gotham. And so he's supporting George Gascon. She's supporting George Gascon. So on my prior videos, people are like, I'm not voting for Kennedy anymore because Shanahan is a George Soros lackey. Now, that's kind of putting a lot of things together, right? That's like saying that, because Donald Trump went to a Packers game and I went to a Packers game, I support Donald Trump. Like there's some correlation there that doesn't make sense. Because Nicole Shanahan supported someone that George Soros supported doesn't connect her to George Soros. Now, there are some legitimate questions that should be asked, like, hey, why were you supporting defund the police initiatives? Because now we might be able to see or say that wasn't such a good idea. Now, Kennedy was on Fox and Friends a couple of weeks ago, and at the end of like a 16-minute interview they did with him, he kind of popcorn addressed some of these things. And I really liked what he said. He said, listen, you'd have to ask Nicole that, but, we were all part of different orthodoxies that a lot of us woke up to during COVID. Like, we believed in certain systems and structures that we found out weren't the systems and structures that they were representing themselves to be. And so we changed our minds. And so she was very passionate about the prison problem, which Kennedy doesn't talk about. But effectively that we've got a for-profit prison system. And as a result of that, there's corporate capture of our judiciary and our legislative system as a result of for-profit prison lobbying. And so, we're locking people up in prison and not giving them proper rehabilitation in order to create a revolving door for the prisons. And in a lot of ways, it would be much less expensive for us as taxpayers because we're the ones paying these prisons through the federal government. It would be less expensive to simply educate, rehabilitate, get criminals, quote unquote, or reformed criminals or people who committed crimes back up on their feet. But we don't do that because it's more profitable for the prison system. So they've created a way to increase their customer lifetime value. It's a very smart marketing model. So she didn't like that. She was aware of that problem, and she thought that part of solving that problem was to defund the police. And according to Kennedy, she realized she was wrong. And Kennedy says she was even part of the recall in San Francisco of the defund the police guy. Now, I don't know what that means because he didn't really elaborate. I tried to look it up. Who's the defund the police guy and the recall in San Francisco? But what he's basically saying is she changed her mind. Well, that's fine. But first of all, that can't be a side dish conversation around Kennedy's existing talking points that we've all heard. We've all heard the other talking points and we're in agreement. And that's why we're supporting him. He needs to lead in with, let me talk to you about Nicole Shanahan. Ask me all the questions you have, any of the concerns you have. And that's what he should be talking about for the first month or two after she gets elected as president. And she's got to start getting on shows and addressing these questions herself. The fact that she doesn't leaves this open loop, and that's going to deter existing enthusiasts for Bobby Kennedy and certainly anybody who is on the swing. So I think this is a mishandle. I mean, I would have had her scheduled for the top 10 podcasts out there that she could be on, and I would have said, we want you asking these questions, what seemingly are difficult questions, but that allow her now to speak into the orthodoxy that we're all trying to wake up to. It would be such a great objection handler. She could say, I want you to think about something that you believed in that turned out to be false. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that, right? Maybe it was trusting your pediatrician. Maybe it was trusting the CDC. Maybe it was, trusting your president or trusting your government. Maybe it was trusting what you were told about a war. Maybe it was trusting your news station, whether it was CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. Man, I mean, she could just platform their platform as an objection handler. That's number one. Cross it off my list. Number two, can she be VP? So, Kennedy was asked this question, and he's usually great with his answers. And you would think someone internally would listen to how he's handling now. Like, I would think there'd be someone dedicated to the campaign like me who's listening to it through the lens of marketing, through the lens of voter objection, who's listening to every single answer he's giving to every single question and saying, hey, we need to fine tune this, right? Reiterate until we nail it. And you'd even do some like smaller audience shows at the beginning to kind of test the response before you go do it on the big shows. Can she be VP? Right? Who is the guy, Cuomo's brother, who was the guy on the news? I forget his name. He's got his own kind of independent media show now. So they have him on. Can she be VP? I mean, number one, she's 37 years old, 38 years old. That's a concern to people. Does she have enough experience? Okay, she was an attorney. Okay, but like, is this a woman who, if she needs to be president of the United States, can be president of the United States? Because by the way, you think about, well, when might she have to step in to be president of the United States? Well, if something happens to the president. Well, could something happen to this president? I mean, this is like the elephant in the room, right? Not only is this president the perfect candidate, if anyone was going to still assassinate a president and Bobby Kennedy became president, like this is the textbook for it. And he comes from a family that's been systematically murdered, right? Arguably even the handsome one that went down in an airplane. So it comes from a family that's been systematically murdered. It's on everyone's mind. You have to be able to answer the question. Can she be president? What does Bobby say? I think she's got a higher IQ than anybody out there. All right. Not a good answer. Not a good answer unless you find out that most voters are basing whether or not they believe a vice president can be president of the United States based on someone's intelligence quotient. If that's how we're basing our decision around whether or not somebody, the litmus, right, of whether someone can become president, great answer. I mean, I haven't looked at the research, but I can tell you right now, that's not the answer. It's not the answer. So you've got to have a better answer. And then he goes on with his fantastic talking points that he's very good at, that we all already understand, which is why we're going to vote for him, right? So, it's something that has to be handled, and it's not being handled. Like I said, she's not on any other interviews right now, so we can't even evaluate her intelligent quotient, even if we believed in that. We can't fall in love with her. We can't understand how does she handle tough questions? How does she handle tough situations? You've got to prep her before you announce her as vice president. You would think she'd have a coach right? Somebody who can coach her on speaking, someone who can coach her on the personality that she needs to adopt or needs to represent, who can tease those aspects of her out of her, who can identify her limiting beliefs and her self-doubts and help her through those so that she can show up in the full expression of this fierce, intelligent, resilient, almost battle-worn but feminine, representing, women and children, mother protector who can handle the job if she needs to. Because we all know a woman, most of you men, if you're in a relationship and you're listening to this right now, your woman could do it. It's like, if your family needed your wife to take over the family, she could do the job. And so I'm not saying that Nicole Shanahan can't do the job. I'm saying you have to show people that she can do the job, right? And that hasn't been done yet. The third thing on my list, and there were really only these three, but I think they're huge, is, hey, did you pick her for the money? The question has to be answered because it seems that way. So you've got to build the case like, hey, these are all the people that we went and considered for vice president. These are the 200, 300 people. Here were the challenges. People where we were ideologically aligned, people who would bring us enough voters, people who, whatever your criteria is. And by the way, if you can't explain your criteria, then you didn't have a good criteria, right? If you can't explain it or you won't explain it, you didn't have good criteria. So shame on you. Yeah, vice presidential pick is important. I think it's the swing pick for this whole election, at least in the case of Bobby Kennedy. And so you got to explain, why'd you pick her, right? And what about the money? Help us understand why it wasn't this person, why it wasn't this person, why it wasn't this person, why it wasn't this person. Now, Bobby's super smart. When I was asking him questions, and not just smart, he's spiritually connected. He's in the zone. He's surrendered a great deal of himself over to a power greater than himself. That's the work he's done in recovery. I asked him some questions. He has some 2 or 3 word answers. You can go listen to that first episode that I published around my private dinner with Bobby Kennedy Jr. He said some powerful shit during that interview that there was no response to, and there's no way you could expect that he said that. An explanation to what's going on in the world. And when he didn't know the answer, he didn't know the answer. And so I'm not so sure anymore. I would think, based on most of what I've seen, that Bobby would be able to answer these questions. Or he'd say hey, here's why I don't feel as a presidential candidate that I need to come out and explain to my voters who my other considerations were and why I picked Shanahan over them. Okay, fine. But people are going to want to know that. You got to say something. You have to address that objection or you ain't going to get the sale. You can't get the vote. And so did you do it for the money? And I even think you can have a sideways objection handler on this, where you can say, look, we're all doing it for the money, right? I'm investing a tremendous amount of my own money in the campaign, right? Nicole has invested a lot of her money in the campaign through my super PAC, and now she's able to directly do that, right? It's a unique situation that now that she's actually part of my ticket, she can invest an unlimited amount of her own money directly into the campaign and we can control it. For those of you who don't know that, that's true. And it's a huge advantage. Right? If Trump wanted to spend his own money, he could. Now, I don't know how much of Trump's own money he spent. He's very good at spending other people's money on the shit that he wants, right? And I don't know how much money Biden had, or how much he's even willing to pull out of the secret stashes that exist here and there, or on a variety of laptops floating around the world. But Kennedy could have said we are all investing our own money. We have to. Because of the way they've locked down this two-party system. There's no way an independent candidate or candidacy or ticket like us can win without investing our own money. And so that was part of the consideration, but it was a small part of it. Here's the rest of the consideration. And make the case. So I still think there's a lot of opportunity. I still think there's time, but I think time is running out. I think the longer you go, and by the way, if you've seen some other interviews where he masterfully handles these objections and addresses these questions, and you're watching on YouTube versus your favorite podcast platform right now, drop me some links. I'll check it out. I'm all in support of this ticket. I also want to just not be like everyone else is being, which is non-critical or not able to give any type of constructive feedback around the group that they support when the group that they support does something right or does something wrong or does something that you don't agree with. You don't have to agree with everything that your candidate does in order to support them. That's part of the problem. And I talk about this in the last episode, 2 episodes ago, where I talked about how we can't even have conversations anymore. It's like we treat politics like sports teams, like our team can do no wrong. And we can't do that. So that's why I wanted, I thought about it quite a bit. Like, do I really want to publish this episode? Is it valuable for other people? Am I doing it out of ego? Am I doing it just for eyeballs on my YouTube channel? Like, what's my motivation? I reached out to the Kennedy team with all this feedback, fairly high up. I said, hey, I'll make myself available to serve in any of these capacities, to coach Nicole, to look at questions, to provide feedback. Haven't heard anything back, and I'm not holding my breath. But I'm hoping someone from the campaign sees this. I'm hoping you see this because, maybe you were someone who's like, she's a Soros lackey, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize she changed her mind. And that can get you back on track with what, you authentically want to support. And it just allows us to be contemplative in a healthy way of everything that we're observing out there. Because I think, whether you're red, whether you're blue, whether you're independent, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're Republican, whether you're independent or you're libertarian or whatever it is, really there's not that much that separates all of us other than ego. When ego gets involved, then we get really passionate about these, what I think are side dish issues, as important as they are for people, that separate us. But the main issues we can tend to all agree on. Now, some people are still waking up to the propaganda of media, to the corporate capture of some of our major industries, to the influence of the military-industrial complex, to the need for election reform and the way lobbying works. Some people just aren't hip to that, right? So it's like there's nothing we can do about them, but we can do about us. And what we do about us is we set our egos aside and we don't take things personally. We have healthy conversations and we look at things in critical and constructive ways. And I hope that's what you got out of this episode. If you did, I encourage you to just share this with somebody else who wants to be a healthy part of this conversation. If you haven't yet subscribed, check out some of my other episodes, both on Bobby and other really important kind of root cause, most important matters issues. And I thank you for being here today, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode. Hey, it's David. Hop on over to davidbear.com. Click right here. There's also a link in the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. You'll get immediate access to my free Mind Hack ebook, as well as a couple of trainings to help you master the inner game. This is a great way to stay informed and be a part of our community and be notified of special announcements. Click below, head on over to the website, get subscribed. If you loved this video, make sure you check out this one or this one, and I will see you in the next video.